Can I open the meeting?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all of you who are taking the time to join us today to discuss, to listen, participate in a discussion on something that, if nothing else, is in the news. We all know what's going on. Russia, Ukraine, NATO, US, then you add energy issues, Nord Stream 2, gas pipelines through Ukraine, and a lot more. Let me just make a very quick introduction. My name is Paolo from Schirach. I am the chair of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University here in Washington, DC. And I also serve as president of the Global Policy Institute, a research outfit that works in conjunction with Bay Atlantic University. And today, as your invitation has clearly stated, we are really privileged to have with us three major experts that will look at this matter of can NATO contain Russia? Somewhat provocative title, and provide us with their own insights and understanding as to where this thing is going. Here we have Ewald König, who is joining us from Berlin, and he has a long and distinguished career as a journalist, as an analyst, as a commentator on Germany, going way back to the issues preceding reunification, when, believe it or not, there were two Germanys. We forget, but this was not that long ago. And of course, East-West relations, and what's happening in the East and Russia and Eastern Europe, and a lot more. He's a native Austrian, but lives in Berlin and been there for a long, long time. Arnie here is in the Washington area, and he has a very distinguished record and experience in international affairs, with particular focus on defense issues and NATO affairs, the Black Sea, energy, and more. And so he'll give us his perspective. And last but by no means least, my old friend Peter Zwack, who spent many years in the US Army as an intelligence officer, and in that capacity he served around the world with distinction, achieving the rank of Brigadier General, and serving most importantly as a defense attaché for the United States, representing the United States in Moscow, which gives him some very, very unique insights on the, on the country that is largely the focus of our discussion today, but beyond that, also in the Balkans and in Afghanistan. And I should mention, and maybe he can elaborate a little more about books that he has authored about his career and experience in Afghanistan and beyond. And that is his effort to kind of conceptualize, aspects of his perspectives on United States foreign and security policies in really complicated environments. So without further ado, let's get going here. Let me just throw this at you, gentlemen, and how do you assess the situation right now? We know about this, I would call them ultimatums from Russia. Maybe you have a better word to describe them, to a list of what Moscow believes that must be done to avoid any escalation of a crisis involving Ukraine and more. Basically, that NATO has to clearly and firmly and openly declare that neither Ukraine nor Georgia nor any other country will be admitted to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. That NATO is big enough, has expanded enough, no more. And that has to be like a solemn pledge. And beyond that, what the Russians believe to be provocative or dangerous military maneuvers close to its borders, or relatively close to its borders have to be stopped, and that would have to include certain deployments of hardware with the inclusion of new generations of theater or intermediate range nuclear weapons. These are kind of, there's more, but this is kind of the thrust of it. There have been meetings on a bilateral basis, US, Russia, but also NATO, and with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. A lot was discussed, and to my knowledge, nothing has been achieved. So the situation is still pending. The Russians have not withdrawn their demands, and the question is, where are we going with this now? Can we start with you, Arnie? What are your thoughts on, at least give us a sense of where we are?
Thanks, Paolo. Again, great to be here with GPI and BAU and speaking to this experienced panel. My initial thoughts are this is, I'd say, generally serious. I think a lot of people really don't realize the extent to which Russia fears or has concern about its borders. And I think this is something that's been simmering for many years, and it's now manifest itself for a variety of reasons into this crisis we're seeing now. I think the best solution, if there's a short-term solution to this, is we can't speak on behalf of the Ukrainians. They have to do this, ultimately do this for themselves. I don't think NATO can make any guarantees, because I think every nation should have the ability to chart its own future defensively, whether it wants to join NATO or not. The other issue is whether deployments and weapons deployments and exercises, there may be some wiggle room there, but I think the red line here is we and NATO cannot agree to any kind of a ultimatum that would deny Ukraine or any other country the ability to engage with the alliance, becoming an alliance member ultimately. So.
Well, same question to you. How do you see things as they are today from your perspective, your experience and your knowledge of East-West relations?
Was it to me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry,
you.
I did not.
No,
okay.
Well,
I see more topics. The most current one is the visit of the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, who is from the Green Party in the new coalition in Berlin. And she visited Mr. Lavrov today. And it was a little bit surprising because he did not humiliate her as he has done with other visitors before, and he's a specialist for this. And their meeting lasted much longer than it was scheduled. So this could be interpreted as more or less a polite and good talk. Of course, there are no results, but also no negative results. And they agreed that they will continue to talk and even negotiate about a peaceful solution. And very important is that Annalena Baerbock tries to re-establish the Normandy format because the Europeans did not play any role in the recent days with all the meetings that you, Paolo, mentioned before. Everything was more or less bilateral between USA and Russia, although it's a very hard European topic, and the Europeans were not able to find a place at the table. And therefore, this is also a question between for the transatlantic relationship, the relation between USA and the EU members, those EU members who are NATO members. And so the Europeans have to find their position to play a role. We see that it is continuously a weak face of the Europeans, that we have the High Representative for External Affairs, number 3, after Ashton and after Federica Mogherini and now Mr. Borrell. They all they have no weight, and it is too difficult to find one voice of now 27 members of the EU in foreign and security policy. It's very important to have, yes, a majority and not the possibility to have a veto, because there are some Eastern EU members who have not the same opinion as in Brussels. That means Poland and the Baltics. So the Europeans are not unanimous. And this is, of course, a very fine situation for President Putin. He just has to wait and to look and to easily he can divide the Europeans. This is also the same with Nord Stream 2, a matter that I'm sure we will talk about later. So the question is, have the Russians the right to have 100,000 troops at the border of Ukraine? I must say, yes, it is their right on their own territory. They can do it. Is it the right of the West to see this as a threat? Yes, of course. It's also the right of NATO to answer with presence, and then it is then the diplomats are in charge. It's the hour for diplomats to find a solution and to de-escalate the tensions. This is the position of Berlin, although in the three-party coalition in Berlin, not all three parties have the same opinion.
All right. So thank you. So that adds another wrinkle here. And as you pointed out, the difficulties of having a united front. Let me move to you, Peter, and ask you something really easy. The Biden administration so far has stated openly, if you do this, Russia, if you invade Ukraine, you will be hit so hard by the most biggest package of economic sanctions in history, right? You will be sorry that you started. And however, it seems to me, please give me your take on this, give us your take on this, that implicitly the use of force has been ruled out, meaning you use force, will respond with sanctions, and they will be devastating. Now, as Ewald pointed out, we're not even sure that we have a united front to do this effectively. And we do have not exactly a great record with sanctions. We sanctioned everybody, from Cuba to Iran to North Korea to everybody, and we don't seem to achieve a lot with these sanctions. Yes, they hurt, but not to the point that the other side says, enough, sorry, can't take this anymore. I'll do whatever you say. So my question to you is, how do you see the current posture of the United States vis-a-vis this crisis? And indeed, should sanctions come into play because the Russians do something bad in Ukraine? They do invade, likely, unlikely as it may be. But then if we do the sanctions, what happens to energy to Europe? As you know, as Ewald alluded to, Nord Stream 2 is not active yet, but there is about 30% of European oil and gas coming from Russia. I don't think the Russians would just, not use this energy weapon if they're hit hard by American sanctions. How do you view all this? That's easy. Tell us.
Thank you, Paolo. It's a good question, complex. I think that Russia, up until now, the Kremlin, has been surprised. In fact, it was probably not in their calculus that NATO and the European Union, it isn't just NATO, with the United States, have mostly held a common front in the face of demands leading to threats that could lead to brinksmanship. I am sympathetic to Europe about the power issue. But in the immortal words of Vladimir Lenin, capitalism will sell us the rope to hang themselves with. Meaning, if there's got to be an imaginative workaround during this period that could, with the energy producing nations, the natural gas and oil, to buttress those countries in Europe that may have to tighten their belts and sweaters a little bit during the cold season. It's very, in my mind, burgerly in my mind, that thinking, because there's a bigger Europe cohesion defining point that if we don't hold the line and ideally come to a peaceful conclusion by the fact we have held the line, then so much of the European and transatlantic experiment will fail. And this is how Putin wins. It isn't just about Ukraine. I don't believe in a military solution. I think that we were NATO or bilaterally or multilateral, US and other nations were to put combat soldiers into Ukraine, that will immediately feed into the Russian existential threat narrative, and they would preemptively launch. And now we are in a world of trouble because we have now Russians and NATO guys and gals killing each other. That's a fiasco, and that could lead into many horrible scenarios. So I believe the center of gravity for us academics of all of this is Western, that includes the United States, cohesion. And Ukraine is a real test of that. And what we do have, the power of our economies and sanctions and diplomacy and the ability to diplomatically isolate Russia up to a point as a response. I do not believe in a conventional military response inside Ukraine, except in giving them weapons and supporting their preparation for insurgencies and protecting them from cyber and all of that.
Thank you, Peter. Let me turn to you, Arnie, because just this segue that our two colleagues here have mentioned, the energy aspect. So you think that, as optimistically, somewhat optimistically, Peter says, we may be creative about this. Before the meeting, as we were talking informally earlier, you were saying, well, America has quite a bit of LNG export potential, which, however, at this time goes to Asia, not to Europe. How do you see all this? And do you believe, as an energy guy, that there is that American additional LNG exports to Europe, in particular to the frontline states, Poland, Lithuania, those that are likely to be hit the hardest by a Russian energy embargo if things go bad?
Paolo, it's not just American energy. It's the nations that have energy, whatever, that help those that don't. This isn't just an American thing. This is everybody trying to work through the problem together on the energy front.
Understand. Good point. Thank you for the clarification. Yes, but I mean, America has, let's say, additional export potential. Then there are others, and we do know that the Europeans have gotten better, not to get too technical here, at creating, how can I say, smoother transfers of energy from one country to another should a crisis occur. Something that didn't exist before, now it's better. So that can function as some sort of shock absorber should there be a crisis in terms of cutting of supplies. But to you, Arnie, do you believe that it's possible to attenuate any kind of a blunt response from Moscow should we enact economic sanctions, and they say, okay, you do that, we cut supplies to Europe, then what? Do you see, as Peter says, that there is a possibility to absorb this blow and kind of soldier on and not be intimidated by the fear of cuts in Russian supplies? What's your assessment? Looking
Yeah,
at
I think
overall generally,
things would have to deteriorate pretty badly for Russia to cut energy supplies to its primary customer. But again, I guess that's one of the possibilities we have to look at is that happening. But even now we're in middle of January. By the time we gear up and start shipments and so on, it'll be later in the winter. So I think on a certain level, yes, we can meet this demand. It'll be extremely expensive because you're going to be competing with the Asian markets, which are going to be paying higher prices for LNG, for instance. I think again, a shorter term, maybe to people are going to hate to hear that you say this, but to fire up your coal plants over the short term to meet the demand for the winter, and then maybe prepare for another. Again, assuming that there's a status quo, there's no. We still have the standoff in Ukraine, and it becomes an energy issue in the next winter. That we have, a better resilience prepared for this. But for right now, in order to meet again the short-term demand for LNG, we could probably meet some of that demand in the immediate term. But again, it'd be a combination of accelerating production and changing, maritime direction and so on. So a lot of things have to happen for winter of 2022, which is already beyond us. So I guess to reiterate, for this current winter, I think we're going to have to look at short-term solutions, which will be burning, coal, other sources to meet the demand, and then look at future possibilities.
Right. Well, let me throw something else at you, gentlemen. I've read a few things. I'm sure you read the same material, more or less, or similar. And maybe it's to you, Ewald, first. People say, "Hey, how about an Austrian solution for Ukraine? Let us neutralize Ukraine so that nobody gets it. It's not in the Western camp, and it's not going to go back into the Russian orbit." And they're citing, you of all people obviously know this extremely well, the Austrian solution, which was the occupying forces after World War II, unlike Germany, withdraw, and in exchange, Austria is neutralized, will not join any security institution. Does that even remotely, does that sound even remotely plausible as a compromise solution for Ukraine, meaning we make the problem somehow go away because Ukraine doesn't join NATO, but it doesn't join anything. And its future is guaranteed. It's a security, that is. What do you think? Your voice.
Good idea. In fact, this could be an option like Austria or like Finland, so-called Finlandization. It is not very plausible, but in the long term, maybe it's some sort of a compromise in this direction. So it could be an option, although it is not very plausible. Of course, the Ukraine is a sovereign state, has the right to decide herself which member of any organization, and the other way, NATO also has the right themselves what to accept as a member, and so it could be.
Thank you for that. Peter.
And may I add, to the Nord Stream 2, because it often is said that Nord Stream 2 could be some sort of a weapon, instrumentalized as a weapon for the Russians against the West. But of course, we have not to forget that it's also vice versa. It also could be used as yes, as an instrument against Russia in the case that the Europeans, especially the Germans, who have nearly 20% of the volume of the gas of Russia importing, that they do not import, that they do not accept the Russian gas, and of course do not pay. This would be very hard for Russia. This was my remark.
Peter, what do you think? Can this idea of a neutralized Ukraine has that any chance of being to your knowledge, has this been discussed at all in these meetings that haven't led to much?
There have been some writing about it, editorials. For Ukraine, in a perfect world, it would have to be a Ukrainian decision. It cannot be dictated by us or by Europe or the Russians. They decide they want to be neutral, and that's really what we're talking about in the Austrian model. And in that, and with that, they have their bilateral and multilateral security arrangements. But this has to be a Ukrainian desire to do it. We can't force them to do it. That would be the distinction that I would make. But basically, you know, you Finlandize. We talked about Austria. The difference being is that Ukraine is a border state to Russia. So yes, it is. I would be open to it as long as this is something that the Ukrainians want and something that we mandate or dictate.
Going further, a little bit further back, according to some analysts, you know, the real mistake on the part of the West was, I believe, was the Bucharest, you know, summit.
Yes.
Summit in which kind of an open-ended sort of invitation, or at least an open door to membership,
Yes.
was you know, issued, and the Russians interpreted this as provocative, as a intent on the part of NATO to proceed in what they claim day and night, every day, that NATO is just about to jump at Russia's throat, that we are one step away from invading Russia. I don't know exactly how they phrase it, but this whole idea of NATO expansion, the most commonly, you know, accepted and proclaimed narrative from Moscow is, you see, they are encircling us, and by pushing the NATO boundaries further east, including Ukraine and Georgia, that's the evidence of it. So the fact that NATO opened the door to Ukrainian membership is evidence of NATO's aggressive intentions. Is this ever going to go away? I mean, or is this just pure propaganda, or do the Russians actually, in your judgment, believe it? Is this even remotely plausible that this is the way they see it? And unless we say never, 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 Ukraine will never join NATO, they will never believe that NATO has really no aggressive intentions.
Is that a question for General Zwack, or just for anybody?
Oh, for you, for everybody, but starting with you, Arnold.
I think the Russians to some extent believe that. I mentioned earlier that they have a visceral fear of their borders because they've been invaded so many times. They've had so many challenges from external threats that they see this as a legitimate concern. Now, let's not forget, it's not just NATO, but it's also the EU, because in 2013, 2014, the EU enhanced engagement, whatever, I can't remember the terminology, with Ukraine was what set off the Maidan movement.
Yes.
Primarily. So it's primarily a Western concern encroaching on Russia, which is, I think, is very disconcerting to them. But also, I think we need to be serious in that Putin is able to leverage this for domestic position, for his domestic base, and he's very capable and very clever about doing that. But I think deep down there's also there's these concerns of external threats that keep cropping up. So yeah, and then let me just get back with what General Zwack mentioned earlier, was this necessarily has to be a Ukrainian decision. Absolutely, we can't have a repeat of what happened in 1938 over Czechoslovakia, where essentially Western powers decided their fate for them. And I think a lot of this has to do with allowing the Ukrainians to make that decision and defend or deter for themselves. And right now, my understanding is that they are looking for a closer Western relationship, which is, again, one of the reasons prompting a lot of this concern from the Kremlin. So anyways, those are my thoughts. Let me stop here and I'll let the other gentleman comment.
How do you view this, Ewald? Do you think that this is just propaganda, or that the Russians actually believe that NATO has an aggressive posture and it's out to get them?
You see that the decisive mistake was done 3 decades ago, because after the fall of the Iron Curtain, it was said that the NATO will not go eastwards. So it was some connotation in the talks, but there is no written document. And this is a tragedy, because this is the problem and the reason for the distrust of the Russians. And therefore it could be interesting what Mr. Stoltenberg, head of NATO, is promising to Russia, that in the frame of the NATO-Russia Council, he will give written answers to the preconditions and to the questions of the Russians. So I think this will happen in the next days or next week. And this maybe is some end point to the mistake that happened more than 3 decades ago.
Do you agree with that? That it was, basically that NATO expansion in the light of the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact Treaty Organization, that it was a bad idea, that or of course it's a bit late now, but that expanding NATO, starting with what was it, Poland or Hungary, I forgot exactly, the first 3, and then all the others that came in 2004, and now down to Montenegro and small states, that it was an unenlightened policy on the part of the United States and other NATO countries to allow or welcome, invite former Soviet satellite countries and piece of Russia, the Baltics, to join NATO, that this was a bad idea in the light of the disappearance of the Red Army, or now it's immaterial? What's your take on this, Peter?
I was a young staff officer up in the Joint Chiefs in the late 90s in their NATO policy directorate for 3 years. My specific portfolio was the Partnership for Peace, which was a remarkable program for its time. Oh, by the way, for a while, Russia was part of it. And then I had the portfolio of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. And there were serious efforts to try to work with the Russians on this, and the NATO-Russia Founding Act and all of that. It comes down, and your historians and several from Europe, the sense about NATO enlargement, and this is where the Russians have a hard time grappling with, it's not all about Russia. This is all no, this was also about Eastern and Central Europe, from Ukraine all the way to Czech and all of that has been caught in wars, in invasions, in pogroms, left and right, back through history almost immemorial. Pacts and alliances and irredentism, and the whole idea of NATO enlargement out there was to bring in these countries that crave stability. And the fundamental aspect of NATO that I remind our Russian colleagues is that this is a voluntary thing. They want to be in NATO. Why do they want to be in NATO? The Warsaw Pact was not voluntary. And the things started to morph and evolve into an increasingly, if you will, Russia-focused thing. And yes, it enlarged. The Baltics, they remember 1940 and the annexation by the Soviet Union. I mean, so there's a lot of history and baggage leading to it. And it wasn't all about Russia. We all lost Russia, in my mind, in the 1990s, to include the Russians. That's what my book, Swimming the Volga, there's my advertisement. And so no, I am a firm NATO advocate. I was in Russia and spoke last June at the Moscow Security Conference, and I spoke about NATO. And my talking point, basically, like, Russia, you better hope that you don't get what you wish for, because if you somehow, or NATO and you were somehow to fracture, what would come in its place? And would it be stable, or would it be mini pacts and entente? Would it be right wing? And if there's anything the Russians know, right wing in Europe, emboldened, is dangerous from Russia. Finally, the other NATO point, Russia. Think out a generation. Would you rather have a Europe without a strong organized bloc in the world? Would Russia really be safer a generation from now in a world without NATO, with everything else that's going on out there? Over to you. So I'm a NATO advocate.
Okay, you know, it's interesting to hear this perspective. Let's delve a little bit deeper, especially for our friends who are with us today and who may not be as well acquainted with these matters as you gentlemen are. Of course, Ukraine is a bit special. I mean, you can argue, well, Poland is special and the Baltics are special for all different reasons. But Ukraine, as the Russians care to remind us all the time, the history of Ukraine is intertwined with the very, very, very origins of the Russian state. So that there are these ties which are religious, in part ethnic, and in part of a shared history. So this is not just another bordering country. And that somehow we have failed in the West to fully appreciate the relevance of these historic ties, and the fact that, as we know, a significant percentage of Ukrainians are ethnic Russians, beginning, as we figured out a few years ago, with Crimea. Is there anything that can be done to assuage Russian concerns, some of which I think are legitimate, that ethnic Russians outside of their borders are treated fairly? Of course, at the time of the Maidan, let's call it insurrection, they came up with all sorts of preposterous stories that the Russians were being hunted down and that there were these squads that they were about to kill everybody, and this was some kind of a humanitarian intervention that the Russians needed to engage in to save, literally, their persecuted brethren, on the other side of the border. But from where you are, do you think that this is just too complicated to tackle? Is there anything that can be done? Obviously, this would require the active cooperation of the Ukrainian government, which is not exactly on friendly terms with Moscow these days, since they're engaging in an insurrection or fostering an insurrection in the Donbas region, not to mention, the unilateral annexation of Crimea. In other words, is this matter of Ukraine-Russia relations too complicated to tackle, or can we unwind this? Can we, in some fashion, when I say we, I don't mean that Washington has any solution to this, but at least to be facilitator to try to propose a better modus vivendi between these two neighbors, specifically Russia and Ukraine. All the things that Peter said earlier on, we need to stand firm, we cannot accept intimidation, ultimatums, and all that. But in all this, is there any sweeteners? Is there anything at all that can be constructively, offered to Moscow to assuage their concerns about the fate of ethnic Russians in Ukraine? Or does this even matter at all in the present circumstances? To you, Ewald, what do you think? Thank you.
It's up to the Europeans to try to mediate between the USA and the Russians, and to clarify to President Putin, who is looking for more influence in his sphere that was the territory of the Soviet Union, and to show him that everything which is done by the EU and by NATO eastwards is not a reason for him to be nervous. So to be very close with information, with transparency, and and also with close informations. So this is a topic for diplomats, not for the military, and this has to go ahead.
By the way, we have a question from our audience, which puts a kind of a little different twist on all this, asking the panelists, how do you see in this context, in this fluid situation, Russian propensity to act indirectly? That is not the old-fashioned invasion with mechanized divisions crossing borders with flags at the head of the brigades, but acting surreptitiously, covert operations, asymmetric warfare, using proxy forces, irregulars. Is that an option? Do you see that as a possibility in which they will say, like they've done in Ukraine, we haven't done anything, we're not there? Do you see soldiers with Russian military uniforms? You don't, so we're not there. So can this kind of gimmick be, which has been used before, be used again? And so here we are in a no-win situation, or somewhat, because they're doing something to destabilize Ukraine, but we can't really prove it in a clear fashion. What do you see? Do you see that as a possibility?
Let me try to give an answer before the experts give the answer. So my thing is no, I wait for the answers of the experts. Thank you, and then I give my answer. Sorry for interruption.
Not a problem.
Yeah,
Peter, what do you see? Asymmetric warfare, cyber sabotage. Is that in the cards?
It's already happening.
Okay.
And it's classic, as we saw in 2014, even before the more overt aspects of the Russian invasion. You had cyber, you had electronic warfare, you had disinformation, you had subversion. I was in Moscow at the time, and the news reporting on their state channels about the poor Ukrainian Russian families being killed and suffering and all of that. If I were a coal miner in Novosibirsk, I wanted to drop my digger and pick up a Kalashnikov and go and fight. So all of that is going on. The narrative is on in Russia right now, preparing, if you will, trying to prepare the population, who is not completely blind. The Russian population is actually pretty connected, but they're patriotic and they're going to go along with what their regime, unless this thing gets really, really bad. So yes, they have all the tools. And unlike the democracies in this continuum between war and peace, they're already at war. We're very uncomfortable, meaning the disinformation, cyber, all these things that are going on right now. Yes, and the military coming overtly is really the last step. So the ground is being prepared. That doesn't mean they're going to invade, but they are getting ready, everybody worries about provocations. Provocation is what gave the justification for the Nazis at the final moments after a buildup and demands to invade Poland. So it's all there. It's an autocratic, authoritarian playbook that we're seeing. And the good news is that the European countries have set up these hybrid warfare centers and are much smarter than we were in 13 and 14. But it is a hard place. Hopefully the Russians will decide it's not worth the effort, but we're a long way from that.
How do you view this, Arnie? Do you see that the Russians can obtain their goal of creating a mess and destabilizing Ukraine without fulfilling what seems to be their, unspoken promise of direct military action, that asymmetric warfare and all this, special measures and that Peter alluded to, that which is already happening? Can we face this successfully, and the Ukrainians on their own and with the support of Europe and NATO and the US, can we help the Ukrainians withstand these kind of asymmetric destabilization efforts?
I would say yes. It's hard for me to add anything to what General Zwack said because he covered it so well. But the point that I wanted to make was, I think what happened in 2014 was a shock. Nobody, especially the Ukrainians, didn't know how to respond. The little green men, all these things happened. I think we're much more savvy now. When I say we, I mean NATO certainly has put a lot of effort into asymmetric or hybrid warfare countermeasures, whether it's from the cyber aspect, from malign influence, countering with strategic communications and so on. So I would say, yeah, absolutely. There's already going on now, but I think it's important to know that there are generally effective countermeasures that we can utilize and are utilizing to withstand this onslaught. And part of that is strategic communications, whereas putting out a different version, putting out our what we consider to be the correct version of an issue, immediately responding to these things. So instead of letting it fester and let, so there's aspects it's going to be very difficult because it operates beneath the surface, and in a democracy these are very hard. These are challenges to the very fabric of how we function in a democracy. These asymmetric challenges really attack these basic foundations. But I think there are ways. We're proving that again. Through a lot of it through trial and error, but certainly through a clear message. That's probably the best way to counter this. But I'll let Ewald conclude, as I think he had some comments he wanted to make.
Sure, Ewald, your take on this.
Yeah, very short. Although there are more and more concerns in Germany and in Europe about eventual invasion in Ukraine, I myself do not believe that Russia will invade Ukraine, but there are other means, as you mentioned, cyber attack or means to destabilize or to support the extreme right-wing people with the aim of destabilizing, or an example to blackmail the Western countries in the way as it was done in Belarus with the refugees. So it was poor blackmailing, yeah? And with this information. these are the means, I think, that are more realistic than an invasion.
Well, thank you for that. But let's try to see, we're getting a little bit close to the end of our time that is allocated to us. Let me see if there are any other. No, not other questions at the moment, but let me try to see if we can put all this together. We touch on so many different aspects of this problem, but I want to go back to what you were saying, Peter, in your initial remarks. What you said, that when all is said and done, we're holding together, right? For the moment, at least, the West did not fall apart with everybody going in a different direction and trying to cut their own deals and whatnot. Ewald pointed out that the Europeans don't feel properly represented in these negotiations, even though, of course, there were NATO negotiations, or at least a fora, and the Vienna forum where everybody is there. But certainly, from a European standpoint, it would appear that all this is guided from Washington, and it's Washington, Moscow, and the Europeans are the equivalent of flyover country, as we would say here about the middle of the United States. So, but that said, and even taking into account of the legitimate concerns of our allies to be properly informed, consulted, listened to, do you see, Peter, that we're holding together, and that if this crisis or potential crisis continues, because the Russians seem to be able to control these things, every now and then they ratchet up the pressure, turn on the spigots and say, hey, you need to do, there's this problem, there's this other problem. And then we're always in a reactive mode to whatever they bring to the table. Do you think that the West will continue to be able to hold together and face the various scenarios that we've tried to discuss today, whether it's about retaliation to sanctions in the form of cuts in energy supply, what we just talked about in terms of cyber warfare or asymmetric countermeasures, which, by the way, don't necessarily have to be limited to Ukraine, right? They can try to hit anywhere. They can try to hit the French or the Spaniards, for that matter, as a NATO and Western allies. It's not like there's a limitation of the field of action of these specialists in countermeasures. But are you, Peter, at the end of this discussion, reasonably optimistic in our ability to hold together and fend this thing off, or at least to not allow it to become a disaster for the West, and of course for the Ukrainians in particular? Or what's your take? And I'll ask the same question to the other panelists.
I think I want to make the point that the Biden administration has been scrupulous about trying to keep in close coordination and links with Europe. It is Russia that's trying to peel us off from Europe. And they will want to talk to us, but I think that our interagency, our leadership is quite mindful. They want to speak with a Euro-Atlantic common voice. In that, we have been mostly, I think, successful. Here is what concerns me, really concerns me, is that status quo, meaning if the Russians kind of get hung up, and this may be sort of the urgency, meaning they're not succeeding on the political and diplomatic track that they wish. They may feel an aspect that the world politically and diplomatically is beginning to close around them. They've got forces that are in being in winter along the border, and people start vibrating, and you see the increasing demands and the threats and the discussion of provocations. And the question is are the Russians, not part of their plan, putting themselves into a situation where they feel they can't back out of? And that point, meaning to back out with the feeling that they have not shown weakness, both internationally and to their domestic population. And at that point, do they accept status quo and some awkward, or do they double down and go and push harder? I think that that's something to worry about. So no, I think that up till now the West has done pretty well. Probably the crisis point will be if the Russians do come, and I don't think the Russians want to invade, but it is in their kit bag. They're on a precipice. Standing there forever isn't going to work. Do they step forward? They really don't want to, but stepping back is not a good alternative. They're in the situation where what do we do in the West if they do invade Ukraine in a big way? Lots of Ukrainians are killed. And now we're all vibrating. What do we do to help the Ukrainians? I don't believe in NATO, US boots in the ground in Ukraine. But if there is bloodshed, big bloodshed, an invasion, politically, it's going to be a free-for-all among our countries. What do we do about Ukraine?
Ewald, same question to you. Do you think that the West can hold together and keep Russia at bay?
Yes, I'm hopeful. Not too optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And let me add one other point. We have to look who is benefiting from this situation. China is benefiting because China is very much monitoring the mistakes between Russia and Europe, or Russia and the West. And they learn from it, and they try to have an own balance and to keep close contact to Russia. And we have seen this, for example, when a couple of days ago in Kazakhstan was always eager to have balanced situation with Russia and also with China. China very interested in the resources of Kazakhstan. And so China is very closely observing this situation, and we should take care of it.
Thank you for that. That's obviously a very important angle that unfortunately we didn't have much time to cover, but that maybe for another conversation, how the Chinese are looking, at our moves and what lessons they draw. Obviously, the obvious comparison is Taiwan, right? I mean, that's everybody says that, and nothing particularly original about bringing this up on my part. But Arnie, what's your take? Again, do you share the guarded optimism of our colleagues here that we can muddle through, that we can hold the line and not fall apart in front of Russian bullism?
Yeah. I want to thank first Ewald for bringing up China, because that is the lessons being observed right now are very very important. I'm with my colleagues here. I think the NATO and the alliance, and the whole transatlantic dynamic is much stronger than a lot of people probably realize. It's taken a lot of abuse over the last 70 years and has continued to be fairly resilient. Clearly, Ukraine is a test of this alliance and of our cohesion. There may be some cracks, but I think ultimately we will. It may be a disappointment for the Ukrainians, our response, but I think the NATO and the West will still be a coherent front. I think the bottom line is, we need to, when I say we, the West needs to support Ukraine without putting boots on the ground, supporting them through, whether it's through financial, military aid, and so on. Because I think the Ukrainians on their own could do fairly well. It's just that they need the support, and I think the West will, in a certain respect, abide by the alliance and the agreements that we come up with over the next several weeks moving forward.
Thank you for that. Again, for whatever it's worth, I know this doesn't sound like a lot, but it's been reported, at least in the US media, and I'm sure, Ewald, I hope it has been captured also in Europe, that there is as we speak, a bipartisan delegation of fairly senior US senators in Kiev, right? There to, at least as a gesture of saying to the Ukrainian government, Americans may be divided on, unfortunately, too many things politically, but on this, we're together. There is a bipartisan agreement, which goes, emanating from the White House, but percolating through the US Congress, whereby we're united on this. We're not going to let you down. Again, these are gestures. A congressional visit is not the most dramatic foreign policy development in history, but it's not insignificant either as tangible evidence of we're with you. So I think that matters, and I do believe that there is, as there has been, bipartisan support to approve additional weapons shipments, to sales and shipments to Ukraine, including the necessary training or what have you. So that line is open. I think the Ukrainians can count on the US on that. Again, how helpful that is in the face of an immediate crisis, not so sure. But it is a deterrent for that says Ukraine is not alone. We're not going to drop Ukraine because it's too uncomfortable. So I know we have not, unfortunately, resolved the issue, but we tried. And I really appreciate very much the contributions and the insights and analysis provided by you, gentlemen. I appreciate our audience following us online. And I'm sure, regrettably, that we will have to revisit this, because I don't think this is going to go away, or there'll be other facets of the broader East-West confrontation. And as Ewald and both Arnie alluded to, we certainly, I think it would be appropriate for us to look at this more broadly, because my personal concern is that the Cold War 2.0, it's not Russia as a sequel to the Soviet Union, but it's China, unfortunately, with Russia as a junior partner in this, anti-Western grouping, such as it is. So that is a different scenario altogether, but I hope we will have a chance to examine it together. So with that, on behalf of Bay Atlantic University and the Global Policy Institute, I would like to really thank our guests, Arnie, Ewald, and Peter. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for giving us your time. And I also want to thank my good colleague and friend, Denise Caritas, who is the Executive Director of the Global Policy Institute, for her great work, as always, to put together these events and coordinating everything. So with that, we stand adjourned. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.